Hello there, and welcome to my guide for painting the Chee Wow Ma squad pack for Star Wars Shatterpoint. That's the one with Princess Leia. So the very first thing I've done is sprayed them all with some matte white spray from Colourforge. I've also kept the most of the Ewoks off their bases, as it's going to be a lot easier to paint them this way. And starting with the fur for two of the Ewoks, I'm first going to use some Dryad bark. I'm also going to use that Dryad bark to paint all of the trees and the tree branches that are on the bases. Next, a couple of the Ewoks are going to get some Eshin Grey for their fur. And for the other two, I'm going to use some Steel Legion Drab. Then for Paplo, we're going to use some Mournfang Brown. Then we're going to give all the fur and all the wood a wash with some Agrax Earthshade. While our wash dries, I'm going to use some Fenrisian Grey to paint the trousers of Princess Leia, and you can see a little bit of her shirt peeking out from underneath her gun arm, so don't forget to paint that as well. This section will then be given a wash with some thinned down Nuln oil. Now I've thinned that down with some Lamia medium, basically to get a much more smoother transition. Once the washes have dried, I'm going to start back with the Dryad bark, and I'm going to relayer the Dryad bark by dry brushing it onto the miniature, making sure that you don't go too hard, so we pick out all that detail. Then continuing with the dry brush, this time we're going to use a 70-30 mix of Dryad bark and Gothel brown. And then lastly, a 50-50 mix of Dryad bark and Gothel brown for the final dry brush. Then we're going to move on to the Eshin Grey, and we're going to use Eshin Grey just to dry brush that back on, and once again making sure it's nice and light so we keep some of that wash. This will then be followed by a 50-50 mix of Eshin Grey and Mechanicus Standard Grey. And then finally Mechanicus Standard Grey just by itself. This is going to be the lightest dry brush, so try not to push too hard. Then moving to the Steel Legion Drab, we're going to dry brush some Steel Legion Drab on there. Followed by a 50-50 mix of Steel Legion Drab and Baneblade Brown. And then finally Baneblade Brown just by itself. Then going back to Paplo, we're going to dry brush on some Mournfang Brown. And this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Mournfang Brown and Scrag Brown for the next layer. And then finally Scrag Brown just by itself to try and pick out all the finer details. Then to highlight all of the wood, we're going to use a 70-30 mix of Dryad bark and Mournfang Brown for the first layer. And then that same mix but at a 50-50 ratio. Try to take care that you don't get it on the areas you've already dry brushed. Then moving on to Chief Chirper, we're going to paint his fur with some grey cere. Don't worry about doing his little feet that are touching the base or the wood, as those are actually a completely different colour. And then we're going to give him a wash with some thinned down Nuln oil. This is a little thicker than the one for the Fenrisian Grey though. And speaking of which, we're just going to simply relayer the Fenrisian Grey, taking care to avoid any of the recesses. And to give it a highlight, we're going to use a 50-50 mix of Fenrisian Grey and Grey Cere. Moving on to her poncho and the green parts of her hat, I'm going to use some Elysian Green. And for the shade, we're going to use some Athonian Camo Shade. And while that wash dries, we're going to go back to Chief Chirper and we're going to dry brush on the Grey Cere. And this will be followed by a second dry brush of a 50-50 mix of Grey Cere and Matte White. I'm then going to paint Chief Chirper's cloth and any other Ewoks I want to be a darker brown with some Dryad bark. Next I'm going to use some Mournfang Brown. I'm just picking Ewoks at random at this point just to basically do the cloth, so there's a little bit of variation in their colour scheme, so it's up to you how you paint your Ewoks. And then again, we're going to do the same with some more Ewoks, but this time we're going to be using some Morghast bone. And then for Paplu and any other remaining Ewoks, we're going to use some Rakarth flesh. And then finally, for any cloth or pouches that are left over, I'm going to use some Rhinox hide for a much deeper, darker brown than the Dryad bark, just so these things stand out a little bit more. I'm then going to paint Chief Chirpa's fingers and toes with some Rhinox hide. For all the wood they are holding, like their stars and their bows, I'm going to use some Steel Legion drab. Then for the strings and the cloth, I'm going to use some Zandri dust. There are a few bones dotted here and there, so for that I'm going to use some Wraithbone. There's also some hair poking out of Paplo's staff, and for that I'm going to use a little bit of XV88. Then all the wood and the cloth will get washed with some Agrax Earthshade. Then for Princess Leia, I'm going to relayer the Elysium Green, taking care to avoid any of the recesses and just to neaten up any of the wash. And now I'm going to start working on the camouflage pattern. So first colour I'm going to use is some Nurgling Green. This is going to be very haphazard. You can try and follow a guide, but I'm just going to place it anywhere I feel like it should be. I'm then going to use a little bit of Caliban Green for the more darker spots. And some Mournfang Brown. Then lastly, some Ogryn Camo for a few more lighter green spots. Moving back to Chief Chirpa, we're first going to relayer the Dryad bark and making sure we avoid any of the recesses. And then this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Dryad bark and Gothor Brown for the first highlight. And then Gothor Brown just by itself for the final highlight. Then to start highlighting the Mournfang Brown, I'm first going to relayer the Mournfang Brown once again and making sure I avoid any of the recesses. This will then be followed by a 50-50 mix of Mournfang Brown and Scrag Brown. And then finally Scrag Brown just by itself. Next we'll move on to the Morghast Bone. Once again we're going to relayer the Morghast Bone, obviously taking care to avoid any of the recesses. You're going to get sick of me saying that. Then we're going to use a 50-50 mix of Morghast Bone and Wraithbone. And then finally a 70-30 mix of Morghast Bone and Wraithbone in favour of the Wraithbone. And then finally for the last set of cloth, which should be the Rakarth flesh, we're just going to simply relayer the Rakarth flesh. This will then be followed by a 70-30 mix of Rakarth flesh and Pallid Witch flesh. Then that same mix, but at a 50-50 ratio. Then on to the wood, and we're going to simply relayer the Steel Legion drab. Then that'll be followed by a 50-50 mix of Steel Legion drab and Baneblade brown. And then Baneblade brown just by itself. For all the cloth and the ropes, we're going to relayer the Zandri dust. Now be very careful with this bit. Try to use the edge of the brush. This is probably the most trickiest part because there's quite a lot of detail. As you can see, I put it on a little bit thick myself. This will then be followed by a 50-50 mix of Zandri dust and Ushabti bone. Then for any bones, we're going to simply relayer the Wraithbone. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Wraithbone and Matte White. I'm then going to break out the Dryad bark and I'm going to paint the lips of all of the Ewoks. Be very careful with this and use your thinnest brush. Then I'm very carefully going to use some Matte White to start painting the teeth of Chief Chirpa and Pablo. Then I'm going to use some Abaddon Black to paint their eyes and their noses. And while we've got that Abaddon Black out, we're going to go back to Princess Leia, and we're going to paint her boots, her belt, her gun, and certain areas of her hat. Next, I'm going to use some Eshin Grey to paint all the feathers that are on the Ewoks, and any remaining bits that need to be finished off. Then the Abaddon Black and the Eshin Grey will receive a wash with some Nuln Oil. Then we're going to move on to the black detail. I'm going to start highlighting that with some Corvus Black. Don't forget to include the noses. And then after that, we'll follow that up with some, I don't know why I said after that, we'll follow that, obviously after that and follow that are the same thing. We'll follow that up with some Eshin Grey. Moving on to Princess Leia's skin, I'm going to use some Kislev flesh. This will then get washed with some Reichland flesh shade. Make sure it doesn't pool, you don't need too much. And once that has dried, I'm going to start painting the eyes very carefully with a thin brush, starting with some Abaddon Black. This will be followed by matte white. And then lastly, some Abaddon Black again for the pupils. Then I'm going to relayer the Kislev flesh, taking care to avoid any of the recesses. And this will then be followed by a 50-50 mix of Kislev flesh and matte white for a second highlight. Then moving on to the bases now. These bases need to be some sort of forestry texture or muddy texture, so I'm going to use some Stir Mud Technical Paint to basically cover all the gaps and to get rid of the concrete, as it does look a bit weird with those Ewoks standing on it. Once that has dried, we're then going to use some Dryad Bark to paint the rest of the muddy areas. And there's a little bit of Imperial machinery that Pablo is standing on. It looks a bit like something from an ATST. So for that, I'm going to use some Mechanica Standard Grey. Then for the rest of the rocks, I'm going to use some Dawnstone. I'm also going to use it for the arrow tips. For the little leaves that are sticking up out of the bases, I'm going to use some Death Guard Green. Next, all of the bases will receive a dry brush with some Carrick Stone. Then the rims will be painted with some Abaddon Black. And then I'm going to wash the base with some watered down Agrax Earthshade. Now, of course, we're not going to leave it just as muddy as that, so I'm then going to add some PVA glue to the base, and I'm going to use some static grass, and I've got some leaves as well that I'm going to place on the base, but feel free to do your base however you wish. In the end, it should look something like this, and I'm very happy with the result. And with that, that's the first lot of Ewoks finished, along with Princess Leia, of course. I had a lot of fun painting these guys. I do have the other pack as well, so I'll do a paint guide for those when I start painting them. These guys didn't take too long whatsoever either. They only took around about 8 hours for all of them. As I said, they are quite a lot of fun to paint, and it is best to paint the Ewoks separately from their bases. It's just a lot easier to get round the back and get where you need to go. If you follow this guide, I really do hope it helped, and if you want to see more, we've got more Star Wars Shatterpoint stuff up on the channel, as well as other games like Marvel Crisis Protocol, Warhammer 40,000, and Masters of the Universe Battlegrounds, all sorts of stuff. It basically all comes down to whatever I fancy painting that week. Thanks again for watching, really do hope it helped, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye for now.